Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Jason Wingard. I am the Dean of the Columbia University School of Professional Studies. It is a pleasure to have you all here tonight. It is a pleasure to have our esteemed panelists. First, I'll let you know, Columbia University School of Professional Studies, it is a graduate school. We are focused on lifelong learning. We offer degrees. We offer lots of courses. We are charged with trying to bring the world's experiences to the classroom and beyond. So we are trying to train tomorrow's workers for today and for tomorrow. I am proud to be a member of the board of the Roundabout Theater Company. And Roundabout, I am also proud to say, is the most esteemed nonprofit theater company in the world. And Roundabout is really charged right now with being the platform for this topic around diversifying the theater experience here on Broadway. So we'll talk more about that. Talks at Columbia. This is a platform. We are filming it here today live. Talks at Columbia is a platform for bringing thought leadership from Columbia University, faculty across the university, to all of our alumni and to the world at large. And so we are here to talk about a topic that is near and dear to our hearts, and Talks at Columbia is a platform that will do that. And so let's talk about the classics. First, I will give you a primer. So in the 1960s, Death of a Salesman. Who wrote Death of a Salesman?
Arthur Miller.
Arthur Miller, of course. Also, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Also premiered. So that's the 60s. Then we move into the 1970s. Hits like Harold Pinter's Betrayal. You remember that one. The musical Chicago, also in the 1970s. These two plays were by white men, and they featured the predominantly white context of the white family. Okay? Then we get into the 1980s, a little bit of a shift here. August Wilson, he directed a play called Fences. Okay? So that was a black man in August Wilson writing about the black man experience. Then we have Phantom of the Opera. Phantom of the Opera became one of the most financially successful plays of all time, okay, as a musical. We moved into the 90s, a little bit more of groundbreaking territory. Angels in America. So that's a story about homosexuality in America. Then we moved into the first few years of the 21st century. So we have Top Dog, Underdog. So that was about two African-American brothers, and it was written by an African-American female. Then we move into the last couple of years. So what plays do you think resonate for you as newly formed classics? So we have Hadestown. Is that it? Is that the biggest one of the last couple of years? Dear Evan Hansen. How about Frozen? Does that get the list? Is there anything else the last couple of years? Hamilton, of course, Hamilton. So Hamilton is a play that has broken lots of barriers. So previously, the plays that were the biggest, the Disney plays, the ones that financially had the biggest success were around $50 million a year. Hamilton, double that, $100 million. It takes a historic representation of an American figure, and it uses a very culturally diverse and racially mixed cast to play out that story. And it also uses a genre of music that is ethnically motivated in what? Hip hop, right? So you have hip hop music, you have an ethnically diverse and racially diverse cast, and you have this play that is focused on a story that could be in the classic genre, but it blows up into something phenomenal. So we're going to talk about something today. We're going to talk about classics, and we're going to talk about what is a classic and who decides what that canon is, and we're also going to talk about who should be cast in the classics. And we're going to talk about that debate a little bit. The reason why we're talking about that is for four reasons, right? Number one is what I just said, the emergence of Hamilton, this non-traditional play that exploded onto the scene. The second is the shifting demographics of the audience. So the audience is shifting. It's not the same as what it used to be. And so because of that shift, we are seeing differences in the business. And the third is that, the evolving business demands of the Broadway theater. We have some people who can speak to that here today, but because business is changing, we all know money makes the world change in positive and negative ways, and the theater is changing in one of those ways, and we'll talk about it. And the last is progressive attitudes about business, about organizations. Now, let's be clear, the theater is an industry and it is a business. And as progressive attitudes change, particularly in entertainment around diversity, the theater must respond, okay? So we're gonna talk about that, and we have a variety of panelists here with us today. So we have the Uber performer. I'm gonna go into these a little bit in more detail. We have the super producer, right? And then we have our tag team of writers, a dynamic duo there both from Columbia, and then we have the administrator, the esteemed CEO, okay? So let me give you a little bit more about who they are. Vanessa Williams needs no introduction, but I'm going to tell you a little bit anyway, for those of you who happen to have been hiding under a rock for the last couple of decades. She's a Tony, Emmy, and Grammy-nominated actress and singer. She's a music and performing star. Her platinum single, Colors of the Wind, from the Disney film Pocahontas, won the Oscar, won the Grammy, and won the Golden Globe for Best Original Song. She's also a fellow member of the Board of Directors for Roundabout Theater, along with me. Welcome, Vanessa. Thank you for being here. Next, we have Alia Jones-Harvey. And Alia is a Tony Award-nominated lead producer on Broadway, including Eclipsed and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. You've seen both of those. She's currently the only woman of color serving as a lead producer on Broadway. So think about that. So she's producing The Great White Way in that regard. She's also currently on the producing team of the 12-time Tony nominee Ain't Too Proud, The Life and Time of the Temptations. All right, so welcome, Alia. Thank you for being here. Next, we have David Henry Hwang. David is a Tony Award-winning playwright, screenwriter, television writer. His stage work includes M. Butterfly, Chinglish, Yellowface, as well as the Broadway musicals Aida, Flower Drum Song, and Disney's Tarzan. He's also an associate He's also an associate professor at Columbia University, we're proud to say. He's head of playwriting in the theater department for the Columbia School of the Arts. So David, thank you very much for being here. Next, we have Ming Peiffer. Her play Usual Girls was a New York Times Critics' Pick and received the world premiere production at Roundabout Theater Company in 2018. In TV, she's been a writer on shows at Netflix and for Hulu, and she's currently in development for another original series. Maybe she'll give us a hint as to what that is on Netflix or Hulu. She's also an alumna of Columbia University. Woo! She's a graduate of the School of the Arts. So Ming, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have the CEO, Todd Haimes, who's the artistic director and CEO of Roundabout Theater Company. He also serves on the board of Alliance of Resident Theaters, the service organization representing all nonprofit theaters in New York City. He's also a member of the Broadway League Executive Committee. And he's an executive in residence at the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University. Welcome, Todd. Thank you very much for being here. So the rules of tonight, we are going to discuss a variety of questions relative to the topic. The topic is, what is a classic, and what kind of casting should be included and involved in making up and delivering a classic? But at the heart of the matter is going to be diversity, right? So should we protect the classics and make them and deliver them and cast them with the audience in mind from the original perspective, or should we mix it up a little bit, the way Hamilton has done, and the way M. Butterfly has done, and other plays on Broadway? So we're going to talk about that. So I'm going to ask some framework questions, but these people are much more experienced than I am, so some of the questions may get turned around. They may ask us questions. We're going to keep this fluid. We're going to have a discussion. So let me start, David, with you, first of all, the professor in the middle, right? What's a classic play?
Well, as you mentioned in framing the question, part of the answer involves, well, who's defining what constitutes a classic. So, of course, a classic's supposed to be work that stands the test of time. So by that definition, it's not possible even to have a modern classic, because like, how would you know? We're not going to be around to find if it's a classic. But we still try to kind of codify works as being classics, even though they're from our time. And I guess for me, as a playwright and a person of color, I feel like when I first started writing plays, and I was writing plays about Asians or Asian Americans, about 10 years ago, I asked some of my colleagues who started when I did, who are also Asian, and I said, what is most surprising to you about what's happened over the years? And one person said, oh, I never thought we'd be studied in schools. So even when we started writing, and my first play was produced in New York in 1980, I feel like even that level of gatekeeper, even that level of credibility in academia was not something that we necessarily thought was going to happen. And so for me, the question over the years becomes, when we first started writing, if you were writing about people of color, generally it was considered sort of ethnic theater, and it was considered less universal than the works that were written by white people, mostly white men, overwhelmingly white men. And so the question for me becomes, are those definitions changing? We're clearly part of academia now, and we are in the not-for-profit theater. Are we also represented sufficiently on Broadway? Are we also considered for our works to be called classics?
So Vanessa, you've worked across a lot of different entertainment venues. How does a classic compare on Broadway versus in these other venues that you've worked in?
Well, coincidentally, we worked on a classic together. It was Trip to Bountiful by Horton Foote. Horton Foote had done it 50 years before in the same theater that we ended up doing it in 2013 with obviously a white cast. It was about his family and his growing up in Texas. We did it with Cicely Tyson, Cuba Gooding Jr., myself, and we did the black version of Trip to Bountiful. We did not have much dialogue change at all because it was a story about a family. So the skin color was kind of irrelevant because it was an aging mother that wanted to come back to her hometown and visit. And she was living in the city of Houston, but she wanted to go back one more time to see the house. Had nothing to do with color, had to do with the story. It was a great success, and it's a classic because it debuted 50 years before, and still we sold out houses, and it was relevant and made people cry because it's all about the story and all about the music in the words, because it was a play, but Horton Foote is phenomenal. And for me as a singer, his words were like lyrics because they were Southern and had lots of a lilt, but also tremendous heart. So it has longevity, stands the test of time, and speaks to the audience. When I see West Side Story, I still get excited because the downbeat starts with the music and I'm right there. No matter how old I am, it always gives me the same kind of feeling. And I think that's what a true classic will do. As soon as the lights go down, you're ready because you know what it's going to give you.
Alia, can you add to that? What makes, if somebody were to ask you as a producer, what makes up a classic? You're getting ready to produce a new play. Obviously, you intend for this to be a classic when you set out. What are those must-have elements in order for it to be a classic that you think about or that you would say to other people that you consider?
Okay, I'm gonna change your question a little bit.
All right.
So I would agree, the classic stands the test of time. When we've looked at producing classics with the term used is non-traditional casting, we're generally looking at whether or not we think the story can be relevant across races, across ethnicities, and if enough of the story can be relevant across races and ethnicities, then we want to look at, casting it differently than it was originally presented. So, for me, the classics have stood the test of time in doing our research on what classics we would want to produce for Broadway. The crass answer is the ones that have done really well. So the ones that have done well financially, of course, are targets for all of the producers on Broadway, and there are many producers now that are using non-traditional casting in a way to approach bringing new audiences to the subject matter, exposing new audiences to playwrights that they might not be familiar with. Horton Foote, was not familiar to many that were in the audience, and many thought that it was a new play written, with this cast in mind, and so we've experienced that on many of the productions, even Tennessee Williams, where people were unfamiliar with Cat on a Hot Tin Roof or unfamiliar with A Streetcar Named Desire. So it was edutainment, as my producing partner, Stephen Bird, has coined, because many times we're introducing the play to a new audience.
So Todd, let's follow up on what Alia just said. So Roundabout focuses on revivals, focuses on revivals of classics. Why does the theater company do that? Why?
Well, first of all, the theater was founded to do that. I kind of inherited that mission, and the mission has expanded greatly since then. But because originally when Roundabout existed, their definition of the classics was Shaw, Ibsen, Chekhov, and occasionally a bad production of Shakespeare. I was interested in contemporary. What to me at the time were contemporary classics. So we added Tom Stoppard and Harold Pinter and Brian Friel and all those playwrights, including doing Arthur Miller's new plays and Harold Pinter's new plays. Having said that, and having seen Roundabout drift in a positive way more towards 50% now new work, but having said that, I sort of echo what everybody's already said, that the classics, keep in mind, we talk about the classics and everybody can fight about, any individual play, but there are thousands of plays that were successful over the last several hundred years. And for most of us, we think of several hundred as being classics, and we might argue about which several hundred, and some we'd all agree on. So I think by the time we get down to that several hundred or whatever it is, we all kind of believe that they do what we've been talking about in this panel, which is they're relevant to every generation. I grew up in the 60s, and there were many plays in the 60s that were groundbreaking and social mores breaking, and they were really important at the time, and now they seem ridiculous. It's already happened. Some of the plays, the sexual revolution is over, blah, blah, blah. And so, probably most of us wouldn't think they were classics, and we might have thought they were classics at the time they were produced. And, my belief, which I believe strongly, is that as theaters like ours, but most of the not-for-profit theaters in New York City and many in the country focus now on doing new work, a lot of it by much more diverse artists, I really believe they will become the classics of the future. I don't think we should eliminate Shakespeare because August Wilson becomes a classic playwright, or David Henry Hwang becomes a classic playwright, or Ming becomes a classic playwright, and I think they all will. But I don't think we should eliminate history, but I think we're making a new generation of classics, and probably some of the ones that we think are classics now may drift off into sort of irrelevance.
So Ming, as the representative millennial,
Yes.
Big pressure.
how did the classics, as defined by your fellow panelists, how did they factor into your development? Did you feel represented? Do you feel included or excluded?
Excluded, and I did not feel represented. I grew up in Ohio, went to public school, so my only real interaction with theater was Shakespeare, and then the musicals that we did in choir, and I actually was Millie in Seven Brides for Seven Brothers in 7th grade, but I also think that's partially because I'm half white, people didn't quite know what to do with me, so then they felt like, oh, we can just throw you in there, which is not, that's a privilege that I have. But it wasn't, and even having that experience, I did not think, because I understood that experience to think, oh, this is only for now, this is the only time you can do that. And speaking to my other, actor friends of color who go through school, even when they go through school, they get chances to do the classics, but only because this is the only time you'll get to do it. And that's often the message that is said to people. And so I went to undergrad being pre-med because I didn't think that, this was an environment for me. And it wasn't until I saw a new play and then participated myself in a new play. I was in Sarah Kane's Blasted, where we had Ian played by a black man, I'm an Asian woman playing Kate, and that was because we had a director who was an Asian director who wanted to make those choices. So it wasn't until I was in college, even though I had you know, I knew what Shakespeare was. I knew some of these classics, but I still didn't think that that was a viable or legitimate option for me. It wasn't until I sort of saw it modeled for me in a diverse sense that I thought, you know, this can be a place where I can carve out a space for myself and for other people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we started our discussion talking about the classics as an art form, right? So what is a classic? And we've gotten a pretty representative view of that. Now let's shift and talk a little bit about the business, right? So I'll start with you, Alia, and you, Todd, as well. If you could both answer the question, how do you raise capital or generate funding for a play, any play, and on the other side, and then how do you make money after you've raised that capital? I'll start with you, Alia. Where do you get the money?
How do you raise money? I will say that our company, Front Row Productions, started with the classics around the idea that a known title would be easier to raise money on, you know. So presenting an investor with a classic work that they're familiar with and saying to them, we are going to incorporate this casting, you know, of theater royalty and new talent, and then we're going to present it on Broadway in such and such a theater on, you know, on these dates, gives the investors that we talk to a perspective on what it is that they're putting their money into. So for me, raising money on classic titles is a lower threshold for someone to engage with. You don't have to educate them about the story. In most cases, they are already familiar with it. Mm-hmm. So then it's just, do you like this casting idea? You know, how do you feel about the dates? How do you feel about the time period that we're going in? And how to raise money generally is presenting, you know, a budget, presenting a projection of where the show could go if it does well, and then also finding those individuals in many cases who have been circling theater for years and have been investing in shows in the past. That's the starting point, I think, for raising capital for plays.
So Todd, how do you get it back once you've raised the money and you've spent it? How do you get it back?
Well, the commercial theater model is totally different from the not-for-profit theater model, and it really is analogous to anybody who saw the original movie of the producers or the musical of the producers. I mean, it's not a lot different. It's different in the fact that commercial producers are not embezzling money, but it's not different in the sense that
there has been one, but
yeah,
for him.
No comment. But it is different in the sense that a commercial production is a encapsulated entity, and at the end of the day, it either makes money, sometimes a great deal of money, or it closes and loses money, and you get an SEC document at the beginning that says you're not going to make any money, you're crazy to invest in this, blah, blah. You have to sign it and then invest in it. A not-for-profit theater is an institution, no matter which one it is. Ours is an institution, and at the end of the year, if we lose $1 million, we don't start at zero the next year. We start at negative $1 million. If we lose $5 million, we start at negative $5 million. So it's a very different model. And for us, there's been a seismic change in Broadway, and I make no value judgment on this. I'm just talking sort of selfishly about Roundabout Theater. We have a huge institution. We have an education program that's the largest in the country, and hundreds of staff members and all that stuff. And what's happened in the Broadway arena in only the last 15 years, for reasons that are pretty obvious if you live in New York City, is that there's been an influx of tourism, which is enormously positive for commercial musicals, and sometimes positive for commercial plays, although less so. And there's been a shrinkage of the tri-state area theater-going audience, which was our bread and butter. Nobody's done any real research on why the tri-state area theater audience has shrunk. We all have hypotheses, but nobody's done any hard research, but it has. Mm-hmm. And so for a theater like ours, our audience is 2/3 tri-state area theater goers. Broadway is 1/3 and shrinking. And so this is not good for us. We've always had to raise a lot of money in contributions. Now we have to raise more. Subscription, which most theaters lived on, is a dying concept for reasons which are valid. I mean, people don't want to commit 6 months in advance anymore to a whole season. They want more flexibility, and that's the way this country advances in certain ways. But it's a reality that we have to face. And so where does that push pressure? A great deal on contributions, but even more on selling single tickets, because contributions are not going to go up 10 or 15% a year. It's almost impossible. But if you have a hit play, even in a limited engagement, it can make a huge difference. And what sells tickets on Broadway? I'm talking about Broadway, where the costs are enormous, and you need to make a significant amount of money back to even cover part of them, are stars. And so, and I have nothing against stars. I love stars. The ones that can do, the ones that are good, and we've never, except that, no. But no, I mean, we've never hired a star where I didn't feel on the first day that they were a star because they were well known, but also because they would deliver a unique performance. And 90% of the time, that's been the case. Every once in a while, it just doesn't work out because that's the nature of art. But it's hard to get celebrities who want to do theater 8 times a week for no money at Roundabout. We're competing with producers who are doing great work, like Alia, who are actually paying their actors well and doing plays. And so for us, it's a struggle, because it's what the plays that we do off-Broadway and off-Broadway, where we do more than half our work, we just pick the product that we love and we cast it as best we can. But on Broadway, we need to find, and so it's a bit of the tail wagging the dog, and it's become harder and it's complicated, and I don't see that changing, so we're doing the best we can.
But from the artistic side, or the artist side, the reason why you do a show for the Roundabout and get paid a little over $1,000 a week, which is the Lure contract, and it's all
$1,600.
Is it really? Okay.
It's a whole different world here.
It's top of mind for her, right?
But it's because I got a chance to work with Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine. So it's not just we're throwing a show together. Kelly O'Hara right now is in Kiss Me Kate, and she's extraordinary. And she's doing it for the same amount of money, but it's an opportunity to do Kate, and she's killing it. And you can see her total range vocally, comedically. She's on fire every night, and that's an opportunity for us to be able to do roles that we've always wanted to do, and do it in a finite period, but get a chance to really do what we love to do. I got a chance to work with Sondheim twice, but the second time was on Sondheim and Sondheim. James Lapine called me and said, listen, I'm doing a little show. I hope you can join us. And it was a phenomenal experience. So what you choose are jewels. And the reason why artists want to do it is because to expand, to be creative, to challenge yourself, but to also do these little gems. And that's the luxury of doing something at the Roundabout.
So let me take the flip side of that. So Todd's point is the nonprofit theater in particular needs big stars in order to make money and to be able to survive in an increasingly international Broadway scene, right? What does that say, though, to you, Vanessa, when you think about diversity in terms of actors and actresses and needing a pipeline of talent that can produce and perform in these plays when you need a star? How many stars are in the pipeline who are people of color who can answer the phone, that are willing and that are even available, right, that exist?
It all depends on the specific talent. I mean, you know, luckily I was doing Ugly Betty on television, being paid very well, and I could take my summer and do Sondheim and Sondheim. So I think that's also the mindset. Am I getting my bread and butter so I can do this as, again, a little jewel that you can, you know, taste and jump into?
That's good. Well, we hope you continue to do that.
I will.
It's necessary. That's my plug, Todd. So David, let's go to you and talk a little bit about the audience. So we've talked about the art form. Now we've talked a little bit about the business. Now let's talk about the audience. Who comes to the theater?
So traditionally, the theater audience has tended to be older, tended to be whiter, and was more from the tri-state area. And as Todd referenced, the number of tourists have grown over the years. And it seems to me, therefore, that we're looking at a demographic situation where, by 2040 or so, this will be the countries will be a majority people of color. So if you accept the proposition that people like to see themselves on stages and screens, then it simply becomes a good business model to try to diversify the bodies on stage as well as the stories on stage. And I think Hollywood has picked up on this recently, just in the range of television shows, for instance, and the willingness to kind of carve up demographics. And similarly, even the motion picture business, which is, at least in a studio sense, now largely about blockbusters and tentpoles, understand that a lot of the things they thought were true didn't turn out to be true. There were people used to go, oh, well, movies with female leads don't sell. Well, actually, they sell more. That a movie with an African-American lead won't travel abroad. Well, that's not true anymore. So as there's a commentator named Jeff Yang, who I like, who says, racism is no longer a viable business model. and I think it's just simply makes good business sense to start to diversify on stages as well.
So Alia, can we tie that to your answer about good business in the theater? Do you agree? Does your data suggest that the diversity of the audience ties back to the diversity of who should be cast and what stories should be written?
Absolutely. I think that from the first production that we did, we were proving to the theater owners on Broadway that there was an audience for a non-traditionally cast classic play. In doing the first all-black Cat on a Hot Tin Roof on Broadway, we faced a lot of hesitation, apprehension from the theater, the Broadway community about doing this. Was it a gimmick? Why would something like this be important to bring to Broadway? And at our first rehearsal, Felicia Rashad said then that she studied all of the classics, not just the black classics when she was in school, and never thought that she'd be able to play Big Mama on Broadway. So this was the opportunity of a lifetime for her and James Earl Jones. He comments on the fact that he used monologues of Big Daddy in all of his auditions, but never thought that he would be able to play the role on Broadway. And so it was an opportunity for these cast members to step into these roles. It was also an opportunity for new audiences to come to Broadway. And even when we transferred Cat on a Hot Tin Roof to the West End in London, the Society of London Theatre found out the same thing. We did a study there and actually found out that 78% of the ticket buyers were new to the West End. So they may have been going to the theater off West End in venues that were offering them more diverse options, but this was their opportunity to see themselves on stage, and they took it. So, so we saw that even traveling to the West End, there's definitely a hunger for seeing oneself on the stage, and audiences do respond to it. Now, to the point about New Yorkers versus non-New Yorkers seeing theater and the shift that's happening, it has become more challenging to promote, to advertise plays. Traditionally, we've advertised to the New York theater-going audience because the budget for advertising a play is so much smaller than that of a musical. And so the idea that we can just advertise a play to a New York audience now is no longer true. So the plays you're starting to see the budgets for plays now growing on Broadway as the cost of marketing those plays is growing. So, that's one of the challenges and the result of the fact that the audience is shifting. We've really got to expand the theater that we're advertising to.
So Ming, let's extend on those competing forces. So viewers now, theater goers, have lots of options for their entertainment, from their device to the movie theater to all kinds of streaming shows that could be seen and viewed and accessed in a lot of different ways. So you've seen that, and you participate in content creation for each of those. What would you say the challenge is for audiences, and what is the value proposition of the theater still?
Well, yeah, I think the challenge is getting people to, leave their homes and leave their devices. And so to do that, you really have to have, I think, a bargaining chip to get someone to do that, especially since we're seeing, TV shows, movies are, I think, more diverse than what we're seeing on our theater stages. So, just in my experience with having my play at Roundabout Underground, we sold out before we even opened. And that was not because, we had the same sort of advertisement budget, but the thing that I can hold on to was just that, I had a story that was particularly relevant to the moment and that, featured a woman of color as the main character, but it also wasn't posited sort of as ethnic theater in like what you're talking about, because the thing is that, yes, we had a bunch of Asian people coming and seeing it, but we also saw, a wide range of races, the amount of white people that came up to me and said, I was Kyung, or I related to that. Like, I think also just thinking about, I don't think it's just that we want to see ourselves. I also think that the larger audience, I think white people want to see different things too. I was just flying to Iowa, and there was a guy wearing a Trump shirt, but he was watching a Kumail Nanjiani stand-up on his device, and I was like, this is very interesting. but I truly think that it's everyone benefits from this, and I think some people even went in not knowing necessarily that the play centered around an Asian American woman, but so many people left that feeling like I could have been her, or I related to her. And I think, keeping the conversation just about, if we cast, if we do an all-black version of this classic, we're going to get the black audience, which may be true, but I think you're also going to get, I want to see that. I think white people want to see that too, and I think sometimes people don't even know what it is that they want, and part of it is you need to show them that.
So let's continue on that with you for a second.
Yeah.
So David just said diversity is good for business.
Yes.
Right? So if that's the case, and if Hollywood is more progressive than the theater, why is that? So why aren't there more plays being written with diverse stories and diverse casts? If the data shows, as Todd said also, that it really works, why is it not happening? Have you run into any challenges like that?
Well, I think it's an access issue because, everyone has a device. Everyone has, for the most part, Netflix has a device. There isn't this sense of, even when I go to a theater, I still am often the only person of color or the youngest person, and I've sort of seen some differences, but I think that may be part of the issue of why theater seems to be a little slower.
So Vanessa, let's come to you on that one. So this is the debate, right? So the debate is we have these classic plays, however you define them, and we've defined them a lot, but there's a canon of plays that people think of as these are the ones that must be produced and continue to acted out on stage. So there are some people that would say, for example, Arthur Miller's All My Sons. He wrote it for a certain cast, for a certain time, all-white cast, all-white context. That's how that classic play should be delivered on stage. There are others who say it's just a story. You can mix up the cast. You can have more diversity, as Roundabout did, I'm proud to say. And so you can have some black actors and actresses on telling that story in the same way. What do you think? Should we hold true to the classics and deliver them as they were intended? Or is it okay to diversify them and to deliver them and tell the story in a different way?
Well, I think it's up to the director to get the best performance with the talent that's available. I think that's the first thing that happens on the checklist.
About the
who
art.
can we get? Who do we know? Is it Denzel or is it Tom Cruise, you know? So I think from a marketing standpoint, I was also getting back to the community aspect of the audiences. When I have done black cast plays or musicals, there is my mother's 79, she's a perfect demographic, sees everything, but sees things that are black and also wants to support. She'll see Audra because Audra's in it and because she's a black woman and she wants to support her. So she wants to buy that one ticket to show her support. They also market to churches because that's where traditionally African Americans spend their Sundays. And they can market to them and they come in by the busloads. We used to have Wine Wednesdays on Wednesday, and all these church ladies would come all dressed up, get free wine on Wednesdays, but they come to see Cicely Tyson because they knew that she was going to be good, and they knew that they could see a good show, and we would hear hooting and hollering, but that was their community coming to us. Yeah. After midnight I did. 90-minute, Dule Hill was one of the stars. They brought in specific guest stars to come in. I did about 6 weeks. But it was a classic because it was all Duke Ellington who did all all his arrangements. Wynton Marsalis at Jazz at Lincoln Center, that was the band that you knew that was going to be doing the music, and you heard the classics from the Harlem Renaissance of all the 1930s, Stormy Weather and et cetera. So those were considered classics in our lives as African Americans, and even though it wasn't a classic play, it was an experience that we knew we were going to hear Take the A Train. We were going to see things that resonate in our history. So those can always make money.
Absolutely.
I did do a show, Encores is a series that they put up shows that aren't done normally, and I did one back in 1998 called St. Louis Woman. It was a huge hit. It had not been, all right. It had not been done for years, and apparently like some of the score was destroyed, and we actually got the two original dance arranger and original arrangers to come back and reassemble the score. So we did we did an album for it, and that was a classic that Lena Horne was supposed to do, but again, we did it with all black cast. At that time, we were a hit, but they were afraid because it was a black show that they would have a hard time selling tickets. Yeah. So it's not always a guarantee, but again, that's a black classic.
So David, I'll go to you. So you started by saying diversity is good for business. So what do you personally think about colorblind casting? And what do you think about this debate as to whether we should try to stay truer to the classics in their form or to diversify? Is it better to do it for business, better to do it for social reasons, or better to stay true to the content?
A lot of this debate has sort of been settled in the sense that, I mean, starting from 1959, when Joe Papp opened the first production at the Delacorte and tried, with the mission to produce theater that looked like New York, and cast George C. Scott and James Earl Jones in Merchant of Venice. Basically, you know, from that time, there has been this sort of American tradition of, certainly in Shakespeare, and of being able to cast so-called non-traditionally. That said, you know, if you look at the statistics, and there's an organization called APACE that crunches the numbers for the 12 major not-for-profits, Broadway and the 12 major not-for-profits over, I think it's like the last 8 to 10 years now. And looking at who is cast broken down by race. And over that period, it's still 70 to 80% white, 70 to 80% white actors. And I think I think people are generally surprised to hear that number because they think we're doing better. So as a result, a lot of this so-called non-traditional casting question becomes for me an employment issue. I want to increase the 20 to 30% of actors for color. So therefore, I will embrace an aesthetically inconsistent position, which is I like it when an actor of color gets cast in a traditionally white part, but I don't like it when a white actor plays a character of color because one of these actions helps that 30% and the other exacerbates it.
Todd, let's start talking about the solutions. So we've talked a lot about the context, we've talked a lot about the challenges and some of the opportunities, but what would you say, in your own words, is the challenge that we are addressing here, and how would you like to see that challenge addressed?
Well, I think for theaters like mine, I think you'll see, and I think you're already seeing, but it's rather recent, a change in the color of the people on the stage. And interestingly enough, I got approached by a couple of young-ish, everybody seems young to me now, women directors who I really respected, and they met with me 2 years ago, Lee being one of them, and said, you know, there are a lot of designers out there who are not white, who are really talented. I mean, it's not like you're taking babies, and you should really hire some. And, you know, I went back to the office and I realized it's true, because what happens with designers, for example, is that directors have their team. And so if you're using an experienced director who's white, by definition, their team is probably white. And whether their intentions are racist or not, I'm not getting into what's going on in their mind, it's just they like those people. And so I came back to the office and said, well, this is something I can do. So I wrote a memo to our general managers of all our theaters saying, I don't want to see one production, and we do 9 a year, that doesn't have at least one non-white person in a major design role. And then we got the resumes of all the people that we admire who were young designers and not so young, not all young, who are African American and Asian. And we gave them that so they could, when the director said, well, I have to have this because it's the only person going to do it, we shoved that back on them, and instantly, every production had a non-white designer and continues to, and some have two. And I'm hoping that those designers, in addition to us somewhat shoving it down their throat because we feel they're really talented, not just because they happen to be black, but because they're talented in this case, those designers will hopefully, over the course of time, become members of their team the same way the white designers did. With casting, there's much more openness now to directors. You know, I have to say that, and maybe I'm a little cynical, but when there was a whole movement in the 80s, when I first started, of doing what was then called colorblind, I guess it was called non-traditional casting in those days. And everybody was powerful and for it and everything. And I have to tell you that I was in a lot of rooms with a lot of directors, a lot of white directors, and people who I think were good intentioned, well-intentioned, and liberal, viewed themselves as liberal anyway. And when push came to shove and you were doing a revival, they just couldn't go there. They just couldn't. And now I think the majority of them are. Whether or not they feel pressure, that's their problem, but the majority of them are. So I think in the next decade, I really believe you'll see a major change. Forgetting about the whole star issue, which we've talked about, which is something kind of separate, you'll see a major change in the demographics. I mean, we're seeing it already, both in our writers and designers and actors, and I think it will percolate up quickly. I think. I don't want to be too optimistic, but I'm fairly optimistic about that.
So Ming, if you were optimistic, how would you want theater to respond to the changing demographics in the next 10 years?
Well, I would want there to be, you know, truly equal opportunity for everyone, or I would actually say first I would probably want to see more people of color, almost to make up for the fact that there's been such a lack. I would actually want to overcorrect, and I would want to see a focus on that for a hot second until we decide, okay, we're bored of this, because and I would challenge you to think that we probably wouldn't be. And I think, you know, just thinking about broadening this idea of like what a classic is, I sort of look at it as a young writer. What are the plays that get done, and what are the plays that are like constantly remounted? Like the public is going to do Entozake Shangeis for colored girls, and while, you know, I love that piece and I think in my world that's a classic to me, I felt when the public decided to then do that play, that feels like, oh, other people will now see that as a classic because the public is such you know, a well-known and seen theater. Like, what are the ways in which, because we're taking, at least the young people, you know, we're taking our cues off of our mentors, off what we're seeing that's being programmed and things like that. So when I see the public doing that play, I'm like, okay, this is actually moving into the canon, or that's my perception. And so I would want to see, you know, more expansion also of just what we think are classic plays. And I think we can also decenter it from a Western sense, because there's also all these different countries, you know, that we can be doing classic plays from.
So David, you've been leading this work yourself, but in your role as a professor at Columbia, how are you teaching and what are you teaching the next generation of playwrights?
Well, we're really proud of Ming. No, I mean, I think that it comes down to, in a teaching position, being able to have diversity be a core value of the program, and then letting people, and this is, once you have people in the program, then it really becomes the same objective, which is really to write the thing that makes you uniquely you. Because the thing that makes you different from anyone else, whatever that is most likely going to be the thing that people notice and are attracted to.
Alia, you've done it already, right? So how do we take the model that you have proven to be successful and take that to scale? What is your message to other producers, to other directors, to other playwrights, that it can be done? The classics, however you define it, can be done the way you have been able to do it. What is your advice to them? What is your call to action?
Well, I think that in each of the productions that we've done, the casting was color conscious as opposed to colorblind. And so the first thing I would say is that the playwright, in terms of a play, has the final say as to whether or not we will do non-traditional casting, whether or not we will add some diversity to what was written as a traditionally white play. And so, you know, we've dealt with estates that have their own opinions about whether or not that should happen. And so from the sense that we can find work that speaks to a wider audience because of universal themes that are very specific when they're written in the play, but can be translated to another ethnic group. You know, let's find those and let's do them. But then be very conscious of the choices that we're making as to what the casting is, as to who's been cast in those roles, and if it makes sense. Because a lot of the pushback that we've gotten for our plays has been around, well, does this really make sense that there was a wealthy black family living in this time period? Or does it make sense that the French Quarter in New Orleans was diverse? Which, you know, I thought was incredibly short-sighted, that the original version of Streetcar had to be written with one black man and one, you know, red man, as it was referenced in the play. So it's just like we felt like we were doing a more authentic version of A Streetcar Named Desire than had ever been presented on Broadway. And so I guess my challenge to people that are thinking about doing the classics in a new way, first considering whether or not this is something that should be revived. Is it something that speaks to today in some sense? And then why revive something if you're not offering some new perspective on it in the first place? And so I think that, you know, that's what this type of casting can bring to a storyline. And in doing it, you know, be thoughtful about who you're casting in those roles.
And so Vanessa, you're the double threat. So as an entertainer, you are the big star. You can represent on stage what we're talking about today. But you're also, as a fellow board member of Roundabout Theater, you're a strategist. And so my question to you is, what do you say to our fellow board members and to other leadership of theater companies around the country and around the world about how they should be thinking about this issue and advancing it to Ming's level of optimism, so that we don't just have incremental steps, but we actually make up for lost time and correct it?
Be brave, be bold. My first lead in high school was the Mad Woman of Chaillot as a sophomore. I was a 15-year-old black woman playing an elderly woman, but my director, we had an acting program in our high school, and it was all about the talent and what you could bring to the role. So we've got to look in a broader scope and see what talent speaks to the role. And that's how you get multicultural cast, and also behind the scenes, that's how you can cherry pick people that are diverse to create the production. And as a producer, as a director, you have to be bold and take chances. That's what Hamilton did. They didn't know it was going to work, but I remember seeing it at the public and saying, I don't know what this is, but it's fantastic. And it's that adrenaline rush because it's a story. So when you have stories that resonate with the audience, doesn't matter who's on stage. I mean, obviously they have to be talented, but if the story resonates, you'll make money because people are going to want to see it, and it's word of mouth and communities coming to support.
And so that's the summary of our discussion. That's what Hamilton did, right?
Be brave.
Be brave.
Yeah.
I want to thank our panelists here tonight, an esteemed group and talented group of individuals for joining us for this important discussion. Thank you all in the audience for being here. We've been talking today about how we can focus on keeping the classics true to their original intention, but also focusing on how we can be authentic and bringing lots of collections of actors and actresses to these stories. So this has been an important discussion. We are hoping, again, to get Ming to your level of optimism. We are going to make up for what we haven't been able to do to date, and we're going to continue to press. It's good for money, it's good for our social status, it's good for the art form itself. So again, thank you for joining us for this edition of Talks at Columbia.